You'll be collecting geospatial data for the first project using your telephone. And you are going to be doing that using the GPS enabled part of your phone or a GNSS if you want to ramp it up a little bit. What is a GPS? Well, GPS is part of a global navigational system, a satellite system, which uses satellites that broadcast little time signatures. These time signatures can then be triangulated by your receiver, which is your phone or your watch or your GPS device, whatever you have, to determine a precise location. There are a bunch of different types of GNSS out there. We know Global Positioning System, or GPS, because that's the American system. But there's also something called GLONASS, which is the Russian system, and a European Union one called Galileo. There's also a Chinese one too, and a really strong GNSS will actually use more than one of these satellite systems to make as precise a location as it possibly can, because the accuracy of GNSS location is directly dependent on the number of satellites that are being used and the quality of the data that's being used. That data can also be corrected by something called a base station. Base station use usually happens when you are doing really precise measurements, like you have to be within a centimeter of error. So if you're building a road or a bridge or something like that, they'll establish a base station relatively close to where the project is taking place, or in a larger city like Anchorage, there'll actually be base stations that are already established within the city, and the GNSS will be corrected from those. You can also correct the quality of the data by using something called a satellite-based augmentation system, which was developed originally for the Federal Aviation Administration and helps airplanes to determine the accuracy of their GPS. This can be done in Alaska, and it works great in an airplane when you're up high because you can see over the horizon very well. But in Alaska, things start to break down a little bit because the satellites are fairly low on the horizon. This here is an image that shows how GPS works. Essentially, you've got these satellites that are sending out these little bits and pieces of information. They're collected by the receiver. The receiver then uses it to do this triangulation. Once you have a GNSS location, then you can start to collect spatial data. This can be as simple as a point, a simple location. I am at this precise geographic coordinate. But it could be a string of these together in which we would create a line. Or it can be an area defined by lines that are all connected, that are called polygons. We'll be using all of these forms of spatial data. These forms of spatial data are referred to as vector forms of spatial data and will become very important when we start talking about vector data later on, but they'll also be an important part of this project as well. In addition to collecting and creating the very spatial data, the locational stuff, we can also start to associate other types of data with the points, lines, or polygons. And these data are referred to, the non-spatial data, as attributes of the spatial data. Attribute data can come in all sorts of different forms. It can just be strings, which are words. In other words, you want to name something. You want to refer to a particular trail name, for example, would be a string of words. Or they can be integers, which are, of course, just single numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4. Or they can be floating point attributes, which would have a decimal. Or they can be some sort of Boolean question, a yes or a no, a true or a false, an either or an or. All of these data can be collected as attributes. They can be tied to the spatial data so that then we then have not just a point or a line or a polygon, but other stuff that we can use to fill or symbolize those data with. Those data can then all be displayed later on. We are going to be using something called a KML file to display it. This is something that can be projected through Google Earth. And you're also going to be using something called a CSV, which is a tabular form of data that we can use a spreadsheet software like Excel or Google Sheets to look at. So these are the basic data types that will be available in the way that geospatial data is collected, especially for this project on your phone, but there'll be a lot more about all of this stuff later in the course.